Welcome to this journey through one of the most deliberately obscured cases recorded in the history of the Missouri Ozarks. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you are watching from and the exact time when you are listening to this narration. We are interested in knowing what places and at what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. In March of 1897, the Springfield Register printed a brief notice that would be the only mainstream acknowledgement of what became known among those who remembered as the Mortimer sisters affair. The article, positioned inconspicuously on page 7, mentioned only that authorities had responded to a disturbance at a boarding house in Stone County and that the matter was being handled by state officials. No names were provided. No details were offered. No follow-up article ever appeared. What makes this case particularly unusual in the annals of Ozark history is not simply that it remains unsolved, but that it was systematically erased from official record. County courthouse files that should contain arrest records, trial transcripts, and investigative reports show only gaps where documents were removed. State archives yield almost nothing. Yet the case could not be entirely eliminated, for truth has a way of surviving in the margins of history. Personal journals kept by those peripherally involved, letters exchanged between worried families, correspondence between county officials and state authorities, and the private notes of investigators who recognized the significance of what they had witnessed. These fragments escaped the purge. Assembled carefully over decades by researchers who understood that absence of official record often indicates something too disturbing for public consumption, these surviving sources reveal a case that challenged the moral comprehension of even hardened lawmen. What follows is a reconstruction of events surrounding Adelaide and Constance Mortimer, two sisters whose boarding house in the small mining town of Galena concealed activities that, 1. Galena, Stone County, in 1897 was a modest settlement of approximately 400 residents, situated along a bend in the James River where limestone bluffs rose sharply from the water's edge. The town owed its existence to lead and zinc mining operations that had drawn prospectors and entrepreneurs to the area throughout the 1,880 By the mid-1890s, several small mines remained active, supported by a business district consisting of 2 general stores, a bank, a livery stable, a blacksmith, and 3 saloons. The Mortimer boarding house stood on the eastern edge of town, where the road curved toward the river crossing. It was a 3-story timber frame structure, unusual for the area where most buildings rose no higher than 2 floors. The house featured a distinctive widow's walk atop the 3rd story, providing a commanding view of the town and surrounding hills. According to property records preserved in the State Land Office archives, Adelaide Mortimer, age 41, and Constance Mortimer, age 38, purchased the property in June 1893 for $850 in cash. The deed listed their previous residence simply as Pennsylvania, with no specific town indicated. Local tax assessor's notes from 1894 describe the building as well-maintained with recent improvements including fresh paint, reinforced foundation, and new shutters on all windows. The sisters established their boarding house shortly after acquisition, advertising rooms for traveling merchants, mine surveyors, and respectable working men. Rates were competitive at $1.50 per night, including 2 meals, or $8 per week for extended stays. Neighbors interviewed years later by researchers consistently described Adelaide and Constance as proper, reserved women who kept immaculate premises and maintained strict household rules. Boarders were expected to be indoors by 9 p.m., no alcohol was permitted on the property, and Sunday mornings were observed quietly, regardless of religious affiliation. The sisters' reputation for cleanliness became well known in Galena. Sarah Mitchell, whose family lived 3 houses away, noted in her diary that the Mortimer sisters could be seen beating rugs and airing linens with unusual frequency, even during winter months. The house could comfortably accommodate 8 boarders in 4 second-floor rooms, while the sisters occupied the 1st floor and the 3rd floor remained mysteriously unused. What can be determined about Adelaide and Constance Mortimer comes primarily from observations recorded by townspeople who had limited interaction with the reclusive sisters. Martha Hendricks, a schoolteacher who boarded briefly at the Mortimer house in the autumn of 1894, kept a detailed journal that was discovered among her effects following her death in 1953 and donated to the Stone County Historical Society. Hendricks described the sisters as clearly educated women who spoke with refined Eastern accents and demonstrated knowledge of literature, mathematics, and medical matters unusual for women of their generation. Both were unmarried, which in itself was not remarkable, but their complete financial independence and lack of male relatives or guardians drew quiet comment in a society where such arrangements remained uncommon. The sisters claimed their father, Dr. Edmund Mortimer, had practiced medicine in rural Pennsylvania, and that both daughters had served as nurses during the Civil War, gaining practical medical training in field hospitals. Adelaide, the elder, handled all business matters, including rent collection, supply purchasing, and correspondence. She was described as tall and angular with dark hair always arranged in a severe bun and an authoritative manner that discouraged familiarity. Constance managed domestic operations, overseeing meal preparation and housekeeping, though the sisters employed no servants and performed all labor themselves. Townspeople noted the sisters never attended church services despite Galena having both Methodist and Baptist congregations, nor did they participate in social functions, quilting circles, or community gatherings. Elizabeth Cooper, a seamstress who occasionally performed alterations for the sisters, recalled in a 1948 interview that both women invariably wore high-collared dresses with long sleeves regardless of season, even during the oppressive heat of Ozark summers. Perhaps most revealing are the purchasing records preserved in ledgers from Galena General Store. Between 1893 and 1897, the Mortimer sisters bought excessive quantities of lye, far more than household cleaning would require, large amounts of muslin and heavier canvas fabric, industrial-grade needles and thread, and various chemicals including formaldehyde and carbolic acid. Curiously, their food purchases seem insufficient for a boarding house, regularly accommodating multiple guests, suggesting either undocumented supply sources or consumption patterns that remain unexplained. The transient nature of the Mortimer boarding house's clientele created conditions where disappearances could occur without immediate notice or alarm. Men traveling alone for business purposes, surveyors mapping remote mining claims, salesmen working circuits that kept them away from home for months at a time. These were individuals whose absence might not be remarked upon for weeks or longer. Letters preserved in the archive of the Galena Post Office, donated by the postmaster's grandson in 1971, reveal a pattern that became apparent only in retrospect. In December 1895, a woman in St. Louis wrote inquiring about her brother, Jacob Thornton, a mining surveyor who had sent a letter in October mentioning his stay at a boarding house in Galena but had not been heard from since. In January 1896, a concerned wife in Springfield sought information about Samuel Marks, a traveling salesman who had written of his lodging at a comfortable establishment in Stone County before his correspondence ceased in November 1895. Similar inquiries arrived sporadically throughout 1896, each describing a man who had mentioned staying in Galena or had been expected to pass through the area but never reached his intended destination. Research conducted in the 1980 seconds by historian David Rawlings identified at least 6 additional cases between 1893 and 1897, where men documented as having stayed at the Mortimer house subsequently vanished from all record. In each instance where families contacted the boarding house directly, they received polite, carefully worded responses from Adelaide Mortimer, explaining that the gentleman in question had departed suddenly, mentioning urgent business elsewhere, and had left no forwarding address. The letters expressed regret at being unable to provide further assistance. No official missing persons reports were filed with Stone County authorities during this period, which was entirely standard for an era when men frequently changed plans without notice, abandoned families to start new lives elsewhere, or simply met with accidents in remote areas where bodies might never be recovered. The geographical scatter of the missing men's origins, from Missouri, Kansas, Arkansas, and Indian Territory, prevented any single jurisdiction from recognizing a pattern, and the limited communication between distant law enforcement agencies meant that connections went undrawn until far too late. On the night of the 14th of March, 1897, residents of Galena were awakened by the sound of the fire bell ringing urgently from the center of town. Flames were visible on the 3rd floor of the Mortimer boarding house, casting an orange glow against the pre-dawn darkness. The volunteer fire brigade, consisting of 17 men under the direction of Fire Chief Thomas Brennan, responded within minutes, pulling their hand pump engine through the muddy streets. According to Chief Brennan's personal log, preserved by his family and made available to researchers in 1979, they arrived to find Constance Mortimer wandering in the street, wearing only a nightgown, her feet bare and bleeding from the gravel. She was speaking rapidly in what Brennan described as tongues, a stream of words that made no coherent sense, her eyes unfocused and her manner suggesting complete disconnection from her surroundings. Adelaide Mortimer was nowhere to be seen, and Constance could not or would not respond to questions about her sister's whereabouts. The fire itself was contained primarily to the 3rd floor attic space, and the brigade managed to prevent its spread to the lower floors, though smoke and water damage affected much of the structure. Once the flames were extinguished and it became safe to enter, several firefighters ascended to the attic to assess the damage and search for potential victims. What they found in that smoke-filled space prompted Chief Brennan to immediately order his men out of the building and send for Sheriff Raymond Walsh and County Coroner Dr. Edwin Foster. The initial newspaper report in the Springfield Register on March 16 stated only that disturbing materials had been found at the boarding house fire scene and that the matter was under investigation by county authorities. No details were provided. Michael Brennan, the fire chief's son, was interviewed in 1961 by a researcher from Missouri State University. He recalled that his father returned home just after sunrise that morning, his face drained of all color, and refused to speak about what he had witnessed for 3 days. When finally pressed by his wife, the elder Brennan said only that he had seen things that proved some people were not right in their souls, and that certain sights, once witnessed, could never be forgotten. Fire Captain Thomas Brennan's official report, sealed by order of the Missouri State Attorney General and placed under 75-year restriction in the state archives, was finally made available to researchers in 1982. The document, written in Brennan's careful hand on official Stone County letterhead, provides the only detailed description of what firefighters encountered in the Mortimer attic on that March morning. The third-floor space, which neighbors had assumed was unused storage, had been extensively modified into a functioning workshop. Multiple oil lanterns hung from ceiling beams, their glass chimneys blackened by smoke. 3 large wooden tables occupied the center of the room, their surfaces stained, dark and scarred by what appeared to be knife marks and chemical burns. An elaborate ventilation system had been installed, with metal pipes running through holes cut in the roof to exhaust fumes, explaining why no unusual odors had alerted neighbors to activities within. The walls were lined with shelving units containing dozens of glass jars of various sizes, their contents obscured by smoke damage and residue. 3 separate workbenches positioned near the windows held specialized equipment that Brennan, a veteran of field hospitals during the Spanish-American War, recognized immediately. Surgical instruments including scalpels, bone saws, and forceps, taxidermy tools for skinning and preservation, and industrial sewing equipment with curved needles and heavy thread designed for working with leather or canvas. The most disturbing discovery occupied the north wall of the attic. 7 complete figures, roughly human-sized, were arranged upright on wooden frames similar to dressmakers' forms. Brennan's description suggests they resembled mannequins or anatomical models, but his report states clearly that upon closer examination in the improving light as smoke cleared, the materials of construction caused him to immediately order evacuation of all personnel and the ceiling of the attic space. He does not specify in writing what those materials were, noting only that Dr. Foster's expertise would be required for proper identification. The report concludes with Brennan's recommendation for immediate intervention by appropriate authorities beyond local jurisdiction, as the matter exceeded the capacity of county resources to investigate or process. Sheriff Raymond Walsh was 53 years old in March 1897, having served as Stone County's chief law enforcement officer for 11 years. A former Union cavalry officer who had seen action at Wilson's Creek and Pea Ridge, Walsh had earned a reputation as a methodical and unshakable lawman who handled the routine violence of frontier life with professional competence. On the morning of March 15, accompanied by County Coroner Dr. Edwin Foster, Walsh entered the sealed attic of the Mortimer boarding house to conduct his preliminary examination. A fragment of Walsh's official report, recovered from state archives in 1983 among misfiled correspondence, provides the only surviving official documentation of that initial investigation. The fragment, badly water-stained and missing its first page, states in Walsh's direct prose, "Materials of human origin confirmed by Dr. Foster's examination. Unknown number of victims represented. Scope and systematic nature suggests extended criminal operation of considerable sophistication. Immediate consultation with state authorities required. Dr. Foster's accompanying medical assessment, preserved in Walsh's personal papers donated by his grandson in 1976, describes the 7 figures in clinical detail. Each stood approximately 5.5 to 6 feet in height, fully articulated at major joints, and dressed in men's clothing of various styles suggesting different time periods over several years. Upon careful examination, Foster determined that the figures had been constructed from actual human remains, preserved through a combination of chemical treatment and taxidermic technique. Skin had been carefully removed, treated, and reconstructed over frameworks of actual human bone. Hair, including facial hair on several figures, was genuine human hair, attached with meticulous precision. Muscle tissue had been replaced with padding, but the overall effect, Foster noted with evident disturbance, was of remarkable anatomical accuracy. The surgical precision evident in the dissection, preservation, and reassembly suggested someone with formal medical or anatomical training and access to professional equipment. Walsh, recognizing immediately that the case exceeded both his experience and his jurisdiction, sent an urgent telegraph to the Missouri State Attorney General's office on the afternoon of March 15, requesting investigative assistance, legal guidance, and direction regarding proper handling of evidence that might implicate parties beyond Stone County's borders. Constance Mortimer was held in the Stone County Jail following her discovery at the fire scene, her condition deteriorating rapidly over the subsequent days. She alternated between periods of catatonic silence and episodes of agitated speech that made no coherent sense to her jailers. On March 18, Reverend Paul Ashford of the Galena Methodist Church requested permission to visit the prisoner. believing that spiritual counsel might provide comfort or clarity. Sheriff Walsh granted the request, and Reverend Ashford's detailed account of their conversation, preserved in the church's pastoral records and discovered during a 1968 renovation, provides the only direct testimony of Constance's explanation for what had occurred in the Mortimer household. According to Ashford's notes, Constance spoke coherently for the first time since the fire, her manner calm and her voice steady. She stated that Adelaide had needed subjects for their important work, explaining that their father had taught them the value of anatomical study and the tragedy of allowing the human form to succumb to decay and dissolution. She described a systematic process by which they selected appropriate boarders, always men traveling alone with no local connections or waiting families, individuals whose absence would not prompt immediate inquiry. Adelaide would administer what Constance termed sleeping drafts in the evening tea, herbal preparations combined with laudanum that ensured the subject experienced no distress or awareness. Constance assisted in what she called the preparation and preservation, applying techniques their father had demonstrated during their childhood when he maintained anatomical specimens for teaching purposes. She insisted repeatedly that they were creating art, preserving masculine beauty and form that would otherwise surrender to corruption and nothingness. Reverend Ashford noted in his account that Constance displayed no remorse, no recognition that her actions constituted moral transgression, speaking instead with what he described as pride in their technical accomplishments. When asked about Adelaide's whereabouts, Constance stated only that her sister had ascended to continue the work elsewhere before the fire began, suggesting Adelaide had departed of her own volition. Most disturbing to Ashford was Constance's evident disappointment that the fire had damaged their collection, lamenting the loss of years of careful work. A coordinated search for Adelaide Mortimer began immediately following Constance's confession, involving Sheriff Walsh's deputies, volunteer posses from surrounding communities, and assistance from law enforcement in adjacent counties. Adelaide's appearance was distinctive enough to make identification relatively straightforward. She stood nearly 6 feet tall with an angular build, dark hair invariably worn in a severe bun at the base of her skull, and a prominent scar on her left hand between thumb and forefinger, reportedly from a childhood accident. Despite these recognizable features and the circulation of her description to lawmen throughout southern Missouri and northern Arkansas, no trace of Adelaide was found. Investigation of her personal quarters on the first floor of the boarding house revealed meticulous financial records documenting every aspect of the boarding house operation. Analysis of these ledgers by a bank examiner from Springfield demonstrated that the establishment had operated at a consistent loss, with expenses regularly exceeding income from boarders. This suggested either an additional source of funds or that profit was never the primary motivation for maintaining the business. A locked cash box discovered hidden beneath a floorboard in Adelaide's bedroom contained $3,400 in bills and coins of various denominations, an enormous sum, equivalent to over $100,000 in modern currency, far exceeding what a modest boarding house could generate through legitimate operations. Among Adelaide's possessions was a leather-bound personal diary covering the years 1893 through early 1897. The entries were written entirely in an elaborate cipher that resisted all attempts at decoding. The journal was sent to cryptography experts at the War Department in Washington, but even experienced codebreakers could not penetrate the system Adelaide had devised. The diary remains in sealed evidence storage, its secrets intact. Records from the railroad depot in nearby Crane, the closest station to Galena, showed no tickets purchased in Adelaide Mortimer's name during the week preceding or following the fire. This absence suggested either that Adelaide had prepared an escape route not involving conventional transportation, or that she had adopted an alternate identity well in advance. Throughout the spring and summer of 1897, reports arrived from various Missouri communities describing sightings of women resembling Adelaide, but none could be confirmed through follow-up investigation. Dr. Edwin Foster undertook the grim task of systematically examining the remains discovered in the Mortimer attic. Assisted by Dr. Harold Penrose, the state medical examiner dispatched from Jefferson City. Their work, conducted over 3 weeks in a sealed room of the Stone County Courthouse, resulted in a detailed inventory documented in Foster's official report to state authorities. The examination revealed 7 complete constructions, as Foster termed them, along with numerous additional preserved components stored in the glass jars lining the attic walls, suggesting the sisters' activities had claimed significantly more victims than the completed figures represented. Dental records, bone measurements, and personal effects found within the clothing of the figures allowed investigators to identify 5 victims conclusively. Jacob Thornton, the mining surveyor from Street Louis last heard from in October 1895, was identified through dental work and a distinctive gold filling. Samuel Marks, the traveling salesman whose wife had inquired about his whereabouts, was recognized by a healed fracture in his left femur, documented in medical records. Peter Wilhelm, a German immigrant whose family had reported him missing in 1894, was identified through dental patterns and a watch engraved with his initials found in his clothing. Robert Chang, a railroad worker of Chinese ancestry, was identified through skeletal measurements and employment records. Thomas Brennan, no relation to the fire captain, a traveling preacher from Arkansas, was recognized through his distinctive bridgework and a Bible inscription. 2 figures remained unidentified despite exhaustive efforts. The additional preserved materials suggested at least 11 total victims whose remains had been utilized in various stages of the sisters' work. The task of notifying victims' families fell to Sheriff Walsh and represented perhaps the most difficult aspect of the investigation. Letters were sent explaining in carefully chosen language what had been discovered and offering families the opportunity to arrange for proper burial. Some families traveled to Galena despite the emotional burden, seeking closure. Others refused to believe the findings, insisting their loved ones must have met different fates. All identified remains were eventually interred in Galena's cemetery in individual graves, while the unidentified remains were buried together beneath a single stone that read simply, "Unknown victims of 1,897. The trial of Constance Mortimer began on the 3rd of May 1897 in Springfield, Greene County, the venue having been changed from Stone County due to intense local sentiment that made impartial jury selection impossible. Prosecuting attorney James Whitfield presented a methodical case detailing the systematic nature of the killings, the calculated selection of victims, and the deliberate concealment that had allowed the crimes to continue for nearly 4 years. Physical evidence from the attic, Dr. Foster's medical findings, and Constance's own statements to Reverend Ashford established beyond doubt that she had participated actively in multiple homicides. Defense attorney Charles Morrison, appointed by the court, argued that Constance was clearly mentally incompetent and could not be held fully responsible for actions committed under the influence of severe delusion. 3 medical experts, including Dr. Penrose from the State Medical Examiner's Office, testified regarding Constance's psychological state, describing what they termed shared psychotic disorder, in which she had adopted and internalized her sister's delusional beliefs. Constance's behavior during the trial alternated unpredictably between periods of lucid defiance and complete catatonic withdrawal. When she did speak coherently, her testimony revealed the elaborate shared delusion that had motivated the sisters' actions. She spoke of preserving masculine essence, of creating perfect specimens that would endure beyond the corruption of the grave, of fulfilling their father's vision of anatomical perfection. She mentioned Dr. Edmund Mortimer's anatomical studies and suggested that both sisters had been exposed from childhood to medical dissection and preservation techniques, normalizing what others would find abhorrent. The jury, composed of 12 men from Springfield and surrounding areas, deliberated for only 2 hours before returning their verdict, guilty of murder but insane at the time of the crimes. Judge Thomas Crawford sentenced Constance Mortimer to indefinite confinement at the Missouri State Lunatic Asylum in Fulton, noting in his closing remarks that the case represented depths of human depravity beyond comprehension and stood as evidence that evil could wear respectable faces and operate within the structures of civilized society. Constance showed no reaction to the verdict, staring ahead with the fixed expression that had become familiar to courtroom observers. During the summer of 1897, a coordinated effort began to suppress public knowledge of the Mortimer case, an undertaking that extended from the governor's office in Jefferson City, down through state agencies, to local officials in Stone County. The official justification, articulated in confidential correspondence between Attorney General Edward Holcomb and Governor Lon Stevens, centered on 3 concerns: protecting the privacy and dignity of victims' families, preventing sensationalistic exploitation that might inspire similar crimes, and maintaining Missouri's reputation during a critical period of economic recovery when the state sought to attract investment and immigration. Sheriff Walsh received direct orders to surrender all physical evidence to state custody, including the preserved remains, the tools and equipment from the attic, Adelaide's encrypted diary, and all photographic documentation. Original case files were removed from the Stone County Courthouse by state officials, leaving only minimal records of Constance's conviction without supporting documentation. Newspaper editors across southern Missouri received visits from state representatives who strongly encouraged the destruction of printing plates and archive copies of articles mentioning the case. The Springfield Register, the Marshfield Chronicle, and smaller publications complied, creating substantial gaps in their historical archives that would puzzle researchers decades later. Dr. Foster's detailed autopsy reports, representing months of meticulous work, were confiscated despite his protests that they held scientific value for future medical jurisprudence. Only Sheriff Walsh's personal notes, which he concealed in his home rather than surrendering to state authorities, survived the purge. These notes, discovered by his grandson in 1976 while sorting through family papers, provided crucial information for later researchers attempting to reconstruct the case. Fire Captain Brennan's sealed report was placed in the state archives under a 75-year restriction, ensuring that his first-hand account would remain inaccessible until 1972. Public records were scrubbed clean, showing only the bare legal citation Mortimer v. State, 1897, with no details of charges, evidence, or testimony. By 1900, just 3 years after the trial, the case had largely faded from public memory, except among those who had been directly involved, and even they spoke of it rarely and reluctantly, as if silence might somehow diminish the horror of what they had witnessed. Missouri State Lunatic Asylum records, partially released in 1972 following expiration of confidentiality restrictions, document Constance Mortimer's 7 years of institutionalization from May 1897 until her death in January 1904. She was confined initially in the maximum security ward reserved for patients considered dangerous to themselves or others, housed in a single cell with barred windows and heavy door locks. Asylum Superintendent Dr. William Blackwell's weekly notes describe Constance as alternately docile and violently agitated, her mental state fluctuating without apparent pattern or trigger. During calm periods, she spent hours producing elaborate drawings on any paper provided to her. These sketches, several dozen of which were preserved in her patient file, depicted figures remarkably similar to the constructions found in the Mortimer attic, along with detailed anatomical studies and pages filled with cryptic symbols that might have been mathematical calculations or some private notation system. Throughout her confinement, Constance refused to discuss Adelaide's whereabouts, despite repeated questioning by asylum staff, state investigators, and even a federal marshal who visited in 1899 following a possible sighting in California. In her lucid moments, which became increasingly rare as years passed, Constance would discuss her work with clinical detachment, explaining preservation techniques and surgical procedures with a sophistication that impressed even the asylum physicians. Dr. Marcus Chen, the attending physician assigned to her case in 1899, noted in his reports that Constance possessed knowledge of anatomy, chemical preservation, and surgical technique that exceeded what could be expected from her claimed nursing experience, suggesting either extensive formal study or years of practical application. Her official diagnosis was recorded as shared psychotic disorder with elaborate delusional systematization, a condition wherein she had adopted and internalized beliefs originating with her sister. Her mental and physical condition deteriorated gradually through the early 1900s. She ceased speaking entirely by 1902 and refused most food, requiring forced feeding to prevent starvation. Constance Mortimer died of pneumonia on the 17th of January 1904 at age 45. She was buried in the asylum cemetery where her grave marker, following institution policy for unclaimed patients, bore only a number, 1,847. Reports of Adelaide Mortimer sightings accumulated over 2 decades following her disappearance, creating a scattered trail of possible encounters that could never be definitively confirmed or dismissed. In late March 1897, a train conductor on the Kansas City to Sacramento line reported to authorities that a woman matching Adelaide's description, particularly her distinctive height and the scar on her left hand, had purchased a ticket for California under the name Mrs. A. Morris. The conductor recalled the passenger specifically because she traveled alone with minimal luggage and kept her face partially obscured by a heavy veil throughout the journey, behavior unusual enough to merit note. In the summer of 1899, a boarding house operator in Santa Fe, New Mexico, contacted local law enforcement about a former tenant who resembled the description circulated by Missouri authorities. The woman, calling herself Miss Adams, had resided there for 3 months before departing suddenly, leaving behind only a few items of clothing and no forwarding address. The most credible sighting came in 1903 when San Francisco police investigated a series of disappearances involving men who had stayed at a waterfront hotel operated by a proprietor known as Mrs. Adelaide Morrison. 3 men had vanished after checking into the establishment between 1901 and 1903, their belongings left in their rooms, but the men themselves never seen again. When investigators attempted to question Mrs. Morrison, they discovered she had abandoned the property 2 days earlier, leaving no trace. The hotel's guest registry and business ledgers were seized as evidence, and in 1958, when these documents were rediscovered during an archive reorganization, handwriting analysis by a forensic specialist noted significant similarities to Adelaide Mortimer's known writing samples from Galena, though the expert concluded the comparison was suggestive rather than conclusive due to the limited exemplars available. 2 theories dominated speculation about Adelaide's fate. The first held that she had successfully assumed a new identity and continued her activities in locations where her past would remain unknown, possibly operating under various names in different cities throughout the West. The alternative theory suggested she had died during her flight from Missouri, perhaps through accident or illness, her body never recovered or identified. Without definitive proof either way, Adelaide Mortimer was legally declared dead in absentia by Stone County court order in 1927. The Mortimer boarding house remained vacant following the discovery, officially condemned by Stone County authorities in March 1897, as a structure associated with criminal activity and therefore unsuitable for human habitation. The Galena Town Council debated immediate demolition, but the cost proved prohibitive for a community of limited resources already struggling with declining mining revenues. The building stood empty, becoming a local taboo that parents used to warn children away from dangerous exploration and that adults avoided when walking through town, particularly after dark. The attic where the sisters had conducted their work was sealed with brick and mortar by order of Sheriff Walsh, creating a permanent barrier that would remain undisturbed for decades. In 1910, the property was purchased by the Kansas City Southern Railroad Company as part of an expansion of freight operations in the region. The company converted the building into a storage facility for equipment and supplies, though the sealed attic remained untouched per explicit terms in the purchase agreement. Workers assigned to the facility frequently reported what they described as an unsettling atmosphere, a persistent sense of unease that made them reluctant to remain in the building alone or after daylight hours. Requests for reassignment to other storage locations became common enough that the railroad's regional supervisor noted the pattern in his operational reports, attributing it to workers' knowledge of the property's history rather than any objective factors. The building was finally demolished in 1923 during a major rail yard expansion that required clearing multiple structures. Rather than salvaging the timber and materials as was standard practice during that era of resource conservation, the demolition crew burned everything on site, reducing the boarding house to ash and charred fragments. The foundation was filled with rubble and covered over, and within months, the location showed no visible evidence of what had stood there. The current site is an empty lot used for freight container storage, identified on modern maps only by its railroad grid coordinates. Local historians researching Galena's past note a persistent reluctance among older residents to discuss the property or its history, a silence that has resulted in most modern residents remaining largely unaware that their community was once home to one of Missouri's most disturbing criminal cases. In 1979, Dr. Margaret Chen of the University of Missouri's Department of Psychology completed a doctoral dissertation titled Shared Psychotic Disorder in Historical Criminal Cases. The Mortimer sisters reconsidered, which provided the first comprehensive psychiatric analysis of Adelaide and Constance Mortimer. Chen's work, drawing on surviving court records, asylum documentation, and contemporary accounts, examined the phenomenon of folie à deux, a rare but well-documented condition in which delusional beliefs transfer between two closely bonded individuals, typically family members living in isolation from broader social contact. Chen's analysis identified Adelaide as the likely dominant personality who originated the delusional system, with Constance serving as the secondary partner who adopted and internalized her sister's beliefs. The sisters' profound isolation, their lack of meaningful social connections beyond superficial business interactions, and probable childhood trauma related to their father's medical work created optimal conditions for the development and reinforcement of shared delusions without external reality testing. Chen compared the Mortimer case to other documented instances of folie à deux in criminal history, including the Papin sisters in France and several Victorian-era cases in Britain, noting common patterns of isolation, rigid belief systems, and progressive escalation of aberrant behavior. The dissertation contextualized the sisters' actions within Victorian death culture, an era when spiritualism, elaborate mourning rituals, and fascination with preserving the appearance of the dead created a social environment where the boundary between appropriate and transgressive treatment of human remains was less clearly defined than in later periods. Chen argued that the sisters' nursing experience during the Civil War, which would have exposed them to industrial-scale death and the practical necessities of handling human remains under traumatic circumstances, likely contributed to desensitization that made their later actions psychologically possible. The case, Chen concluded, represented an intersection of individual psychopathology, environmental opportunity provided by frontier isolation and transient populations, and societal factors, including limited law enforcement, gaps in missing persons investigations, and cultural attitudes that enabled the sisters to operate undetected for years. The dissertation emphasized that understanding such cases requires examining not only individual psychology, but also the broader context that permits and sustains criminal behavior. In 1982, an historian, David Rawlings, was conducting research on 19th-century psychiatric institutions for a broader study of mental health treatment in frontier Missouri when he encountered references to Constance Mortimer in the partially released records of the Missouri State Lunatic Asylum. Intrigued by fragmentary mentions of an 1,897 murder case that seemed to have left almost no trace in standard historical records, Rawlings began tracing connections through obscure archival sources. He discovered references to Fire Captain Thomas Brennan's sealed report and successfully petitioned the state archives to unseal the document, which had reached its 75-year restriction period. Over the next 2 years, Rawlings painstakingly pieced together the case from scattered sources that had escaped the 1,897 suppression effort. Sheriff Walsh's personal notes, donated by his grandson in 1976, Reverend Ashford's pastoral records, preserved in church archives, letters between victims' families and Galena officials, Constance's asylum files, and county land records. In 1984, Rawlings published his findings in a comprehensive article titled The Forgotten Horror, The Mortimer Sisters of Galena, in the Missouri Historical Review. The article brought the case to wider attention among historians and true crime researchers, many of whom had never encountered any reference to the incident, despite familiarity with other 19th-century criminal cases. Throughout the 1,990 seconds, amateur investigators attempted to trace Adelaide Mortimer's possible activities in California, examining San Francisco police records, hotel registries, and newspaper accounts of unsolved disappearances between 1,897 and 1,910. While they uncovered suggestive patterns and circumstantial connections, no conclusive evidence emerged linking Adelaide definitively to crimes in other locations. In 2003, a documentary film crew from a cable television program specializing in historical mysteries visited Galena to film a segment on the Mortimer case. They interviewed descendants of Sheriff Walsh, Fire Captain Brennan, and several townspeople who had been children in 1897, along with local historians and the few remaining residents with direct memory of the property before its demolition. The town's reaction was notably mixed, with some residents welcoming the historical recognition and opportunity to memorialize the victims, while others expressed the wish that the case had remained forgotten, viewing it as an unpleasant stain on community history better left unexamined. The Mortimer sisters case endures as one of the most disturbing and deliberately obscured incidents in Missouri criminal history, notable as much for what remains unknown as for what was eventually discovered. The official victim count remains uncertain, with 7 individuals conclusively identified from the constructions found in the attic, and strong evidence suggesting at least 11 total victims based on the additional preserved materials, though the true number may be considerably higher given the 4 years the sisters operated their boarding house and the countless travelers who passed through the region leaving no record of their journeys. Adelaide Mortimer's ultimate fate remains unknown, with most historians concluding she most likely fled westward and possibly continued her activities under assumed identities in locations where her past would remain hidden, though the alternative possibility that she died during her flight cannot be entirely dismissed. The deeper question of motivation, the psychological mechanisms beyond clinical diagnosis of shared delusion that drove 2 educated women to systematically kill and dismember strangers in pursuit of what they termed artistic preservation, has never been satisfactorily explained despite decades of retrospective analysis. The deliberate erasure of the case from official records raises troubling questions about what other incidents in Missouri and elsewhere might have been similarly suppressed during an era when state authorities wielded considerable power over historical narrative and public memory. Modern Galena maintains a complex relationship with its dark past. The local historical museum includes a small, carefully worded display about the case, but many current residents remain entirely unaware of what occurred on what is now an unmarked lot used for industrial storage. The case carries broader implications for understanding Victorian-era attitudes toward women, mental illness, and criminal justice, revealing how societal assumptions about feminine propriety and domestic spaces could provide cover for extraordinary violence. It serves as a cautionary tale about how isolation, whether geographic or psychological, combined with shared delusion, can manifest in extreme acts that challenge our understanding of human behavior. Perhaps most disturbing is the ease with which people vanished during this period, their absence unnoticed or unremarked, because society had not yet developed systems to track the movement and welfare of transient individuals. In the end, the Mortimer case reminds us that in remote locations like the Ozarks, the past sometimes refuses to remain buried, its echoes persisting in archives, memories, and the landscape itself, in ways that continue to disturb those who encounter them.